Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Welcome to the first hybrid talk from Dr. Japhy Wilson. Japhy's a lecturer in human environment interactions here at Bangor, and his research explores the spatial, ideological, and insurrectional dimensions of the political ecology of planetary urbanisation in the Anthropocene. He's the author of Extractivism and Universality, Inside an Uprising in the Amazon, and Reality of Dreams, Post-Neoliberal Utopias in the Ecuadorian Amazon. His recently published paper, entitled Apocalyptic Urban Surrealism in the City at the End of the World, was awarded 2023 Article of the Year by the journal Urban Studies. And today's talk is called Too Monstrous to Fail, Cannibal Capitalism in the Urban Peruvian Amazon.
Thanks very much. Am I on camera here? So I have to kind of stay around this. Thank you very much, all joining on Teams, and in particular, all joining in person. I'm really glad this is the first hybrid session, and hopefully we can move to full human sessions in the near future and break our kind of weird Teams addiction. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a paper that's currently under review, which is based on, was coming out of my work on Iquitos, a city in the Peruvian Amazon, where I conducted a 12-month ethnography between 2022 and 2023. And I'm theorizing, thinking about Iquitos as the city at the end of the world in two senses of the term. Iquitos is famous for being, or is known for being, famous is probably stretching the truth, the largest city in the world with no road access. And so, in one sense, we can see Iquitos is this city at the end of the world, in terms of spatial terms. But I'm more interested in exploring Iquitos as the city at the end of the world as a synecdoche, that is, as a single thing embodying the place of a more complex wider whole, a synecdoche of our combined and uneven planetary apocalypse, trying to use Iquitos as an extreme metaphor for broader global processes. So it's the city at the end of the world in that sense, in the sense of a city that embodies, in some sense, the apocalyptic present, which we all find ourselves. Iquitos is a city at the heart of the Amazon, so this has evident ecological implications, which is why it's perhaps of interest for this Places of Climate Change seminar. But is it a place of climate change? Yes, in the sense that every place is a place of climate change. But I would ask, or I wonder whether this is the right question to be asking, is the problem climate change, or is the problem capitalism? Capitalism is a system that must grow to survive, and that will do so regardless of the social and ecological consequences, including, but not by any means limited to, climate change. There is, I think, has to be acknowledged, no solution to climate change within the parameters of capitalism. And even if there were, a multitude of other socio-ecological problems generated by capitalism, with which we're all familiar, would persist. And new problems would be generated by the shift to so-called green technology. We've seen some of those problems unfold. In this context, then, I would argue that a narrow focus on climate change and on CO2 as the problem risks functioning as a fetish. That is to say, a fascinating object that conceals and depoliticizes the true issue at stake. This is why the focus of my research is on capitalism rather than on climate change. And this is also why I am some kind of weird version of a Marxist. This paper is based on, well, this talk is based on a paper that I've recently submitted to a journal called Rethinking Marxism. And this is a journal based on constructively critical engagement with Marxist theory. I'm convinced that Marx's theory of capitalism is indispensable for understanding the political ecology of the present. But I also detest narrow Marxist dogmas and orthodoxies and all the kinds of political totalitarian horrors that they've led to. And this journal is kind of a journal of like-minded Marxists who are trying to break with those kinds of orthodoxies and dogmas while retaining what's valuable in Marxism and opening it to more broader kind of ways of thinking of it. It's submitted to a special issue on a controversial recent statement by arguably the world's most famous living Marxist, the human geographer David Harvey, who recently wrote that, quote, capitalism is too big to fail and too monstrous to survive. Now, this caused all kinds of controversy in Marxist circles for reasons I'll come to later. But my paper challenges this claim. See why. Before I start, I want to say a few words about a related topic. My paper draws on critical theorist Nancy Fraser's concept of cannibal capitalism, set out in this book. One of those really annoying moments that probably happen to all of you when you think, I've got a great new theory. And you think, cannibal capitalism, I thought I'd come up with it. And you think, I better just Google it, find it. Googled it, and sure enough, Nancy Fraser just published a book with the same title. Anyway, so my paper draws on the concept of cannibal capitalism. Fraser is an American Jewish professor of critical theory at the New School in New York. And as you may have heard, last month, Fraser was disinvited from taking up a prestigious professorship at the University of Cologne after signing a letter expressing solidarity with Palestinians and condemning the ongoing genocide in Gaza committed by the Israeli state with the full support of the West. There is something disturbing, I'm sure you will agree, about a German institution persecuting a Jewish woman for protesting a genocide. And given that I'm using Fraser's theory, I feel it's important for me to stand in solidarity with her today. And this incident was, of course, part of a broader pattern of repression of academic freedom in relation to the war in Gaza, including the violent arrest of university professors in the USA and the systematic destruction of academic lives and institutions in the Gaza Strip. According to the organisation Scholars Against the War on Palestine, of which I'm a part, 94 academics have been targeted and killed by the Israeli Defense Forces in Gaza since October 2023. 5,213 students have been killed, and every single university in Gaza has been bombed. This has become known as scholasticide. In addition to genocide and scholasticide, a recent article in The Guardian has made a convincing case that the Israeli and American war on Gaza is simultaneously committing ecocide through its systematic environmental destruction of the Strip. No matter how bad the impact of climate change will be in the future, it will surely be no worse than what's happening in Gaza right now, in both social and environmental terms. For all these reasons, and in line with the position of Bangor UCU, I fully support the student encampment here at Bangor in its call for our university to join universities like Trinity College Dublin and the University of Barcelona in divesting from investments in companies collaborating with the Israeli state. And I'd be very happy to discuss this in the Q&A. And as I said, this paper is currently in review, so any comments on its contents would be really useful and appreciated. And as I was going through this paper this morning, I was just thinking to myself, mate, you're completely nuts. So this may be unlike some other academic papers you've heard, but please bear with me, and as I say, I'll be interested to hear your thoughts. In his recent book, The Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, David Harvey suggests that contemporary global capitalism is, quote, too big to fail, too monstrous to survive. In doing so, he acknowledges the epochal deadlock of our time. The socio-ecological catastrophe of capitalism has reached such planetarily perilous proportions that it absolutely must stop now. And yet, the immense scale and uncontrollable dynamics of the system mean that it cannot and will not end. This acknowledgement has drawn an aggressive response from the ranks of orthodox Marxism, kind of Marxism that I don't like, whose belief system is sustained by a stubborn faith in Leninist revolution that shields them from confrontation with this deadlock. But that anxious vitriol contains a peculiar silence. While they uniformly denounce the heresy of Harvey's claim that capitalism is too big to fail, they have nothing to say about a suggestion that it is too monstrous to survive. But is capitalism really too monstrous to survive? Might it instead be too monstrous to fail? Or might its potential downfall lie in the fact that it is not monstrous enough? Harvey himself makes little effort to demonstrate the monstrosity of capitalism, and the fact that this claim was so swiftly passed over by his critics could perhaps be attributed to its apparent self-evidence. But the monster is a powerful and complex metaphor with a long history of deployment in both colonial and critical discourses, and the assertion that global capitalism is too monstrous to survive is not as straightforward as either Harvey or his detractors assume. Beyond its denotation of diabolical beasts and depraved behaviours, the monstrous has been defined as, quote, that which calls into question our epistemological worldview, highlights its fragmentary and inadequate nature, and thereby asks us to acknowledge the failures of our systems of categorization. This threat to ossified conceptual structures might help to explain the reluctance of Harvey's orthodox Marxist critics to engage with his assertion of capitalism's monstrosity, because these kinds of orthodox Marxists are wedded to these kinds of dogmatic ways of thinking. But Marx himself appealed to monstrous metaphors precisely in an attempt to grasp the excessive, unrepresentable aspect of capital. A couple of quotes from his Capital, Volume 1, describing value as, quote, an animated monster which begins to work, and defining capital as, quote, dead labour, which vampire-like lives only by sucking living labour and lives more the more labour it sucks. Other critical theorists have focused on the ways in which the monstrosity of this system is concealed and legitimated by the framing of its excluded and exploited others in equally monstrous terms. Colonial regimes denigrated restive native populations as cannibals and savages, whose monstrosity demanded their repression, and monstrous framings of oppressed peoples as human animals likewise function to legitimate apartheid systems and genocidal massacres today. And that human animals quote is, of course, from the Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant at the start of the current assault on Gaza. Rather than simply rejecting such racist representations of monstrosity, many of these theorists have sought to subvert them by affirming the figure of the monster as a symbol of resistance and rebellious alterity. Such themes, however, are anathema to doctrinaire orthodox Marxists, who implicitly adhere to the bourgeois principles of realism and utility, with the corollary that, quote, the notion of the excessive is often treated as something to be reduced, contained, or secured. The question of capitalism's monstrosity can be more creatively approached from the perspective of the heretical Marxist and dissident surrealist Georges Japhy, a French philosopher and thinker writing in the kind of mid-20th century, who regarded dialectical materialism as a form of idealism to the extent that it projected its own ossified ontological and ethical assumptions onto the world, instead of being attentive to the formless and untamable dynamics of the world itself. Bataille countered this idealist materialism with his own form of base materialism, which he defined as, quote, a crude liberation of human life from the imprisonment and masked pathology of ethics, an appeal to all that is offensive, indestructible, and even despicable, to all that overthrows, perverts, and ridicules spirit. This talk takes Bataille's iconoclastic brand of surrealist Marxism as an inspiration in an ethnographic exploration of the urban monstrosity of the city of Iquitos in the Peruvian Amazon, based on extensive field research conducted in the city between 2019 and 2023. By renouncing the delusional self-assurance and self-congratulatory moralism afforded by the orthodox Marxist fantasy of revolution, and adopting an ethnographic attentiveness to the real of our apocalyptic planetary present. As the anthropologist Anna Singh has suggested, quote, we might look around to notice this strange new world, and we might stretch our imaginations to grasp its contours. Given the normalizing powers of both capitalist ideology and orthodox critique, a project of this kind requires an ethnographic surrealism, which seeks to dislodge established patterns of thought from the well-worn grooves of scholarly convention, and which operates, in the words of the heterodox Marxist David McNally, quote, by way of its estrangement effects, via procedures that make the everyday appear as it truly is, bizarre, shocking, monstrous. The body of a young indigenous woman is draped across a table, her breasts and thighs arranged among jungle fruits and fishes, like the meat at the center of a feast. The white men in suits sitting around her laugh about their latest profits and corruptions, inhaling the sweet scents of the fruits and puking their fine whiskies, their half-unbuttoned shirts. The woman returns the viewer's gaze, forcing us to acknowledge our complicity with the men preparing to gorge themselves upon her. This is the scene portrayed in a painting called The Banquet by the Iquitos-born artist Christian Bendayan, which is part of an exhibition called The Devil's Paradise, in reference to the title of the book that first revealed the crimes of the rubber boom a century before. Driven by burgeoning demand for rubber in the industrial capitals of Europe and North America in the late 19th century, the rubber boom rapidly transformed Iquitos from an anonymous hamlet into a prosperous modern city adorned with the ostentatious architecture of the European Belle Epoque. Its opulence, however, concealed the genocidal violence of the surrounding rubber stations on which its wealth was founded, in which the enslavement of local indigenous peoples was enforced with systemic torture, rape, and murder, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 30,000 members of the Mitoto and Bora tribes. In Hardenberg's words, quote, they are tortured by means of fire and water, and by tying them up, crucified, head down. They are cut to pieces and dismembered with knives, axes, and machetes. Their exploitation was justified as a civilizing act in response to their alleged cannibalism. But as noted by Roger Casement, who travelled to the region in 1910 to investigate these atrocities, the true cannibalism was that of the surplus value extracted through their enslavement. And the British investors who financed these operations would, quote, enjoy the taste of their dividends, for at every meal they sit at a cannibal feast. The primitive accumulation of capital in Iquitos provides a stark illustration of the dominant contemporary mode of accumulation that Nancy Fraser calls cannibal capitalism, which consumes its own social and ecological conditions of existence. The history of Iquitos since the rubber boom has followed this pattern through a further series of extractive booms and busts: precious timber, exotic furs and skins, oil, gold, cocaine. Fed by this spasmodic influx of extracted commodities based on the unregulated ransacking of the surrounding jungle, and functioning as an immense money laundering machine for the illegal industries on which much of its wealth is based, Iquitos has mutated into a metropolis that, as Fraser puts it, quote, devours the very supports on which it relies and cannibalizes its own conditions of possibility. Beneath the Art Nouveau arches of a derelict pavilion in an impoverished periphery of Iquitos, a young mestizo woman in a thin white dress reclines upon a wooden pile. Its terraced levels overflow with mangoes, pineapples, passion fruit, watermelons, papayas, and cakes covered in glittering icing of soft pink and baby blue. People gaze at the delectable spectacle in silence from the humble stalls of the surrounding market. A child reaches out and takes a piece of fruit. Another carries a pink cake carefully away. The market descends on the pyre. The woman gets to her knees and smashes herself in the face with chunks of fruit. The people scramble over and under one another in the haste to grasp the evaporating loot. The prim ironwork of the pavilion casts delicate shadows on the cannibalistic feasting of the crowd. This performance of Bendayan's The Banquet was staged in the barrio of Bajo Belén in 2019 by the Peruvian artist Kay Zeballos. See here. The aim of the performance, in her words, was to, quote, highlight the cannibalization of peoples and lands. But Zavaios had not anticipated the audience's response. Her intention, as she later explained, had been to, quote, inform the public over these vicious practices of power. I honestly imagined that the people were not going to do anything, that they were going to sit. Instead, the inhabitants of Bangor Belen gleefully looted the luxuriant mise-en-scène. Christian Bendayan had attended the performance and was struck by the disturbing new meaning that the audience had imposed on his painting through the revelation of subaltern complicity in the wanton violence of extractive capital. As he observed at the time, quote, the Amazon and its resources are laid out to eat as if they were a banquet, and we are like cannibals who do not realize that we are feasting on ourselves. The unexpected looting of the staging of the banquet poses a profound problem for Fraser's framing of cannibal capitalism and for Harvey's claim that capitalism is too monstrous to survive. Like Harvey, Fraser understands cannibal capitalism as a parasitic system that feeds upon and is resisted by people yearning for a more socially harmonious and environmentally sustainable world, based on what she calls, quote, the nurturing of people and the safeguarding of nature. This was also Zavaios' assumption, but this was not the message delivered in the subversion of her performance by the inhabitants of Bangor Belen. Instead, the looting communicated a libidinal drive to participate in the destructive orgy of cannibal capitalism to which they and their ancestors had been historically subjected. Indeed, such participation is central to the social reproduction of the barrio, in the form of occasional employment in the oil industry and more plentiful work in the illegal gold, timber, and cocaine trades, on clandestine crews operating many days' journey upriver from Iquitos in the roadless and lawless outer reaches of the Peruvian Amazon. This subaltern participation in cannibal capitalism might be explained as a desperate survival strategy by those committed to the socialist humanism of Fraser and Harvey. But that would overlook the rebellious utopian dimension of such endeavours, which is located in the persistent promise of a big haul, the brief pleasures of big spending, and the relative freedom of a life improvised on the margins of wage labour and the law. This dimension was ultimately embraced by Zavaios in her performance at the banquet, in which she first repudiated, but eventually joined the cannibal feast, forcing the flesh of the fruit into her mouth and squeezing the juice until it was pouring down her arms. In her words, quote, in the end, as much as you are part of the wealth, you also exploit it, and you also need it. Or maybe, here she's referring to the character she embodied in the performance, it was an act of rebellion on her part. She chews the fruit because she realizes that the whole world does the same. Carnival Sunday in Bangor Belen. I get to the port of Pueblo Libre at around midday. A gang of masked dancers are drinking aguardiente. One of them passes me the bottle and tells me what the devil means to him. I believe in him, he's a cool guy, the devil sorts you out. The guy with his shirt off. He asks for the devil's help, to keep me working instead of stealing. He's been dancing for 10 years now and has 2 more to go. All the masked dancers of Pueblo Libre pledged to dance for 12 years in honor of the devil, 6 dressed as a demon and 6 in drag accompanying the demons, along with trans women from across Iquitos who also participate in the festivities. Those masked dancers who break their pledge are said to die soon after. But the devil they venerate is not the evil devil of the Christian faith, but the morally ambivalent supai of pre-colonial Amazonian tradition, with whom the Christian devil was combined by missionaries eager to colonize indigenous minds and discredit indigenous beliefs. Unfortunately for the missionaries in Iquitos, the carnival and its devil had escaped ecclesiastical control and mutated into a depraved fiesta. And the devils of Pueblo Libre staged the wildest party of all. Soon the port is filled with hundreds of debauched dancers who storm through the slum towards a concrete warehouse in which they change into their costumes. Most have replaced the masks of indigenous tradition with the later Halloween merchandise of westernized consumer culture. But this is not just another case of the erosion of local customs by the homogenizing forces of global capitalism. Instead, the masks have been modified in accordance with their wearers' own imaginations, contributing to a cannibalistic fusion of multiple cultural forms. This fusion epitomizes the process of cultural anthropophagy, celebrated by the Brazilian modernist Oscar de Andrade's influential Cannibalist Manifesto. Published in 1928, the manifesto endorses the subaltern utopian dimension of cannibal capitalism evident in the urban culture of Iquitos by embracing the accusation of cannibalism leveled against the indigenous peoples of Brazil and the rest of the colonized world, and drawing out its subversive potential. Rejecting both the imposition of Western models and the romanticization of the indigenous noble savage, Andrade affirms the delirious cannibalization of Western cultural forms and their surrealistic fusion with indigenous symbols and practices in new mutant configurations epitomized by the Belen Carnival. To quote his manifesto, "Cannibalism, the permanent transformation of taboo into totem. We were never catechized. What we really made was carnival. We already had communism. We already had the surrealist language." The mass dancers change in the dark so the crowd outside will not know who they are when they emerge or which one among them is the real devil. They say that Lucifer himself joins them in this room and slips out alongside them undetected as the warehouse door is flung open and demons rush into the light. Purple skeletons, red-eyed apes, decomposing clowns, a dissolute rabble of leprous demons escorting a luscious retinue of transsexual courtesans. They fling themselves around the nearest umisha, one of countless palm trees hacked out of the surrounding jungle each year in preparation for the carnival, adorned with plastic household goods and erected on every street corner of the slum. This palm will be felled with the rest and stripped of its wares at the carnival's conclusion. Now it is surrounded by a throng of monsters flaming to a mutant, mashed-up modern version of the traditional carnival flute and drums fed through a distorted sound system to become a heavy electronica. The leader gives a sharp whistle and a swarm of motley beings seeds on to the next umisha, buckets of river water hurled upon them from the upper floors. The air is thick with the sickly smell of marijuana. Haggard trolls gyrate with leering werewolves. Gagging gimps cavort with slavering simians. We drink bowls of masato and cups of aguardiente distributed for free from barrels by the roadside and scrabble for handfuls of candy chucked from makeshift balconies. Fat goblins slowly kick and stamp at the center of the circle while trans women kick off their heels and sprint around its outer limits. Firecrackers explode under the dancers' feet. Wooden phalluses and rubber dildos are thrusted and waved. A werewolf throws his partner onto her back and mounts her, turning his blindly lolling snout towards the leering crowd. Masks are torn off and thrown around like decapitated heads. There is no more circling in homage to the umisha, just crepuscular monsters raving in the dusk. As I stumbled home that night, I drunkenly wondered what we could learn from the mass dancers of Pueblo Libre. There was no explicit politics to their performance, and yet it delivered a powerful message of anarchic autonomy. The police stayed away, and candy, alcohol, and music were all laid on for free. The transgressions of the disguised demons and trans women were a collective statement of emancipation from church and state. And their performance of monstrosity can be interpreted as both an affirmation of their marginalized and pathologized identities and as an implicit critique of the monstrosity of capital inscribed into the foundations of Iquitos by the genocidal crimes of the rubber boom on which its wealth was based. In the mass dance of the devils of Pueblo Libre, this devil's paradise of extracted capital is inverted in the utopian recuperation of an impoverished corner of the city by the descendants of the indigenous workers enslaved, tortured, raped, and murdered in the extraction of the wealth on which this once prosperous city was built. Not utopian in the sense of the socialist fantasy of a harmonious future cleansed of the anthropophagus aberrations of cannibal capitalism, but in the sense of the wild collective embrace of its diabolical inheritance, leaping from its urban tomb in the form of its triumphant undead. The case for Iquitos suggests that far from being too monstrous to succeed, as David Harvey has claimed, cannibal capitalism may in fact be too monstrous to fail. As the Peruvian art critic Gustavo Buntinx has observed, the subaltern art and culture of Iquitos seem to give expression to, quote, a hedonistic apocalypse, a twilight world in festive self-consumption, eating itself out, devouring its own entrails. This apocalyptically utopian dimension is captured by Bataille's concept of expenditure. According to Bataille, production and accumulation are ultimately only means to the end of expenditure, which, quote, instead of locking up life as money is locked in a safe, spends it without counting. Expenditure is not an ideology or a mode of production, but the spontaneous squandering of surplus in destructive and orgiastic excess, which permeates the whole of existence, from social rituals of carnival and potlatch, the superabundance of the jungle, and the limitless outpourings of the sun. Bataille insists on the utopian potential of expenditure, which he says, quote, cannot be subordinated to anything one can account for. It is only by such insubordination, even if it is impoverished, that the human race ceases to be isolated in the unconditional splendor of material things. It is through such insubordination the monstrosity of capital might mutate into cannibal communism. And it is in this sense, as Miguel Abensour has argued, that utopia, quote, for the same reason as violence, excess, delirium, and madness, belongs to what Georges Bataille calls the heterogeneous thing, supposedly charged with an unknowable and dangerous force. This wild utopian possibility is prefigured by Christian Bendian in a recent painting called Anthropophagus Indians, which follows the Cannibalist Manifesto in subverting the colonial slur referred to in its title by staging what has been described as, quote, a reinvented cannibal dream that is voracious in its exuberant digestion of all glories and disgraces. A line of naked cannibals moves through gloomy jungle along a sullen river, their flesh marked with the tattoos of the Bora tribe. The Bora have been marched along the trails of the region under the weight of their extracted rubber, from their immolated villages past their decapitated children, toward the stations that would send the rubber to Iquitos and on to Europe and the USA, while those who brought too little were flogged and left in stocks to eat the maggots writhing in their wounds. But instead of rubber, these Indians bear spears tipped with psychedelic diamonds that transform the decaying matter of the forest floor into filaments of neon light. They are voluptuous, androgynous, transsexual. They are not marching, but touching, kissing, fucking. One holds a flaming torch with which she has just ignited one of the most iconic mansions of Belle Epoque Iquitos, abruptly transposed into the bone-strewn jungle on which the city's wealth was founded, and which its ornate architecture had sumptuously repressed. Now this violence swims to the surface in the inverted form of an uprising performed with hedonistic vitriol by the descendants of its systematic rape, and pointing to the utopian potential for subaltern expenditure to exceed the monstrosity of capital in what Bataille lasciviously foresaw as, quote, a scandalous eruption in the course of which the asexual noble heads of the bourgeoisie popped off.
Really interesting is that you've introduced me to some new authors, and it's such a relief to hear somebody else from a similar dystopian perspective of the world, even if I don't want to go to it. So quite a disclosure in place, but I'm always struggling in the fact that people don't go past the common sense and decide perceptions of what's happening. There's all these findings that say thing that's exploitative. And the decolonisation thing yesterday, it's the same thing which just happened to the environment, it's happening to slave readers, that it's the same trade that happens to people now, it's happening in Palestine. There's justifications of exploitation, and it's all to do with the same, has the same form of things. So it's nice to see all the methods together. I think it's somebody else with kindred perspective.
I gave this paper a couple of months ago in Manchester, and I didn't receive any questions there either, so we'll understand it.
Sorry.
Do you have any questions from online?
Chat.
You can stop sharing, that might be easy.
Ah, yes. We can.
Yes, just stop sharing.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Oh, everyone has an address.
Hi, Japhy. Just a quick question, or a couple of questions.
Hold on, can we just turn you up for a second, maybe? And I
Okay, yeah.
Try again if you know.
Did I let her? Yeah, should I try again? Okay. Can you?
I think it's working. Oh, yeah, it is. Okay, try again, please.
Yeah. Can you just yeah, really interesting talk, Japhy.
Thank you.
Can I just ask about the nature of the participants, the gender mix, age mixes, and were the events you took part in, were they very much, how many people from outside the area got involved? So 3 questions in one.
Are you specifically talking about that last section on the carnival?
Yes, yeah, please, yeah.
I took what can be described as an extremely unsystematic approach to my research in that particular instance. So I can't give you any, I have no breakdown of genders, ages, or anything else. That was a piece of an attempt at mobilizing a methodology of ethnographic surrealism, which was kind of also drawing on Hunter S. Thompson's Gonzo approach, which is basically an approach to ethnography in which you completely, fully immerse yourself in the situation you find yourself in, to the extent of, as I was doing there, drinking with them. I ended up completely wasted, and then very, very sick as well, actually, because I think the masato I was drinking was made with local river water, which their stomachs are acclimatized to, but mine certainly wasn't. So yeah, I didn't really approach it like that. I approached it simply as in terms of rocking up at the event. I had an entry point through a contact who had worked with the organisers of the carnival, who were very kind of local people, at a very grassroots level, and because he gave me a way in, they were happy to accept me in there, because that's a very, as I mentioned in the talk, a very pathologized area, the Kitos, which is regarded by the kind of local elites and even nationally as a kind of den of criminality and vice, which it is, frankly, but in a good way. And so I needed somebody, a trusted kind of contact to get me in there. But once I was in there, once I fully participated. So until I took had my first drink, they weren't quite sure about me. But once I started drinking with them, the barriers came down, and I just fully lived the carnival with them over a 3-day period, and took notes as I was going, took photographs as I was going, spoke to anyone who felt like speaking to me or who I felt like speaking to, and that's the way I approached it.
Yeah, just the images that you had were very, very quite young, quite male.
Yeah, I think a lot.
Just the link on family and households and community and stuff, how that is sort of not represented, or is it undermined? How does all that work together?
There were. I'm not sure if I can't remember from the photographs, but there were actually quite a lot of. Were there children in the photographs? Certainly in the event itself, it was. Although the kind of mask devils were. I mean, that is quite a gendered performance, I guess, because it's basically men, either men performing devils or men in drag, and then also trans women. But for the most part, it's predominantly a masculine, I guess, performance. But very much at the same time, despite being completely debauched and wild, full of children and families, very much a kind of an event in which all members of the community participated.
Okay, thank you. Diolch yn fawr. Reit, diolch.
Thanks, Japhy. Thanks for the talk. Okay. I'm asking again. I'm not at all familiar with all the concepts and stuff that you just presented.
Yeah.
So please correct me if any of my assumptions are wrong. So if I understand correctly, the cannibal capitalism that you're referring to, especially in this particular place in Peruvian Amazon, Quito. So that was the rubber plantation. That's basically what kicked off. And what then you are describing happening in the present day and all of that is basically still the consequences of that carrying forward. So my question really was, okay, the rubber plantation, I believe, must have stopped long time ago. Once they discovered that they can exploit Malaysians and Indonesians now. They don't need to do these people. So what has happened to that place since then? Have they been simply abandoned and left alone, or
The place where the rubber plantations were, you mean?
the Iquitos? So what do these people do now?
Right. Yeah, so thank you. So Fraser's concept of cannibal capitalism is really a way of conceptualizing what she understands as the current phase of capitalism, in which obviously we're facing ecocidal conditions, and yet capitalism continues to grow, continues to exploit and extract everything it can possibly access. And she draws on the cannibal metaphor in a variety of ways, but one of the kind of key central points she's making is that capitalism is now engaged in the kind of devouring of its own conditions of existence, of survival, of continuation, particularly in terms of its ecocidal tendencies, right? So it's cannibalizing itself. She used the example of the kind of there's a mythical snake called the Ouroboros or something like that, which does this, and so she draws a comparison there. And I use the case of, I mean, the rubber boom is the point at which Iquitos came into existence as a city, because it was the kind of central point to which all rubber from the surrounding Amazon was sent before it was then shipped to Europe and the United States. And it was interesting to me that the exploitation and repression of the indigenous population was justified in terms of them being cannibals, right? And that also there was this, and then Roger Casement, who went and did this study and confirmed these reports, then kind of twisted that on its head and argued that it was actually capital, the capitalists having their nice lives in London, who were accumulating the capital as a consequence of this, who were the true cannibals. They were cannibalizing those people, right? So I thought metaphorically there were some interesting resonances there, which would help to kind of work with this idea of, okay, what is the nature of cannibal capitalism? What is monstrous about capitalism, and so on. Whether this is today, what's happening today in Iquitos is purely a consequence of that, I wouldn't go that far. Cannibal capitalism is a global process, and if we look at the basis of the Iquitos economy today, it's, as I mentioned, oil extraction, illegal timber extraction, illegal fluvial gold mining, and cocaine production and export, all of which are, of course, the demand in all these cases is being exerted by global markets. Yeah? And so Iquitos is profoundly integrated in all of these and is, of course, ransacking the Amazon rainforest in order to sustain them. So, but it is connected. I think there is an obvious connection in the sense that many of the descendants of or the survivors of those rubber boom atrocities, once the rubber boom collapsed, the places where rubber was being collected had lots of indigenous people from different places had been kind of pushed in there to work in the extraction, and so they've been kind of uprooted from their original homes in other parts of this vast space. I mean, the area of the Amazon around the region of the Amazon in which Iquitos is the centre is called Loreto, and its size is bigger than Germany, right? So the vast forest, basically. And they've been scattered across it. They were brought into these particular zones for the extraction of rubber, and the survivors, once the rubber boom collapsed, many of them migrated to Iquitos and started to live in these, started to create these informal settlements on its outskirts. And Walter Benjamin, the German philosopher, has an understanding of history, kind of complex, weird understanding of history, which is kind of partly cyclical in the sense that each new kind of moment in history offers an opportunity for the sufferings and failed resistances of past struggles to be redeemed in new struggles and in new forms, social forms. And I think what I'd like to try to argue as I develop this in the book I want to write about Iquitos is that the kinds of ways of life that you see being developed in places like Bajo Belén can be interpreted in this sense, as in some sense of they recuperated the city on which the city founded on the repression of their ancestors in some sense, and they're making it their own in their own way, which doesn't correspond to any of the kind of preconceived ideas we have of the ways in which indigenous Amazonian communities behave. Right? Something completely different. And I think there's things we can learn from it. Yeah.
You know, this because it's quite extreme kind of complicitness that's going on there in the art and that artists. I mean, I was so disturbed with the kids to watch that because it's quite disturbing to see the fact that they then participated and took the cake and ate the thing, and then everybody else did. And kind of that's slightly disturbing because it's not how you think people would react or their exposure to it as well.
Right.
You think, oh gosh, it's just quite heavy, you know, disturbing, violent stuff. So that's quite an extreme thing. But how would you then relate that? Because I think a lot of this kind of battle with our complicity in the West. We are complicit in a system that's, you know, ecocidal, genocidal.
Yeah.
But then we are also, it's less raw. They are kind of almost so stuck in it because that's part of their existence.
Yeah.
In a much more direct way. That we can look at them as to be purveyors of them, but actually we are in that situation. So
Yeah.
how do you marry that, and how do we, I suppose, get that conversation out there so that people, it's not just them over there that are doing it,
Yeah.
but that is something that takes away from the system and really in one system.
Yeah, thanks. No, that's a really, really important point to make, and I really want to make sure, and this will be really useful for me in terms of revising the paper if conceivably it might be given the revising we submit. We'll see. I need to make it clear that I'm not doing that. That's what I meant by Iquitos as a synecdoche or as an extreme metaphor. I'm using it. I want to use it to talk about a global process, but through a focus on a particularly extreme case. And absolutely, all of this should encourage us to reflect on our own roles in cannibal capitalism. And that for example, that's what Kay Zavaios, the artist, kind of was pointing to in one quote, which I'll repeat. She said, "In the end, as much as you're part of the wealth, you also exploit it and you also need it." Or maybe it was an act of rebellion on her part, i.e. the part of the woman she's performing. She chews the fruit because she realizes that the whole world does the same. Yeah, so what the subaltern inhabitants of Iquitos on the very peripheries, most marginalized edges of this global system are, in a sense, doing, or at least part of what they're doing, is laying claim to the right to participate in the same orgy of destructive excess that we're all, let's be honest about it, engaged in. And I'm saying they do absolutely have that right. And let's stop pretending that indigenous communities in the Amazon are you know, totally opposed to extractivism and living in some kind of spiritualized relationship to nature. Because that, again, a bit like CO2, I think, functions as a kind of fetish object to say, okay, there are some good people over there and we can support them, and that can kind of cleanse our consciousnesses and allow us to continue with our own unsustainable behaviors. that fantasy doesn't exist. This is what indigenous Amazonian society looks like. Yeah, let's start from there. Can you?
No worries. It's just.
Close that menu.
This one?
Yes, close that.
It's not going to make anything collapse or go down.
Just check the chat. Yeah. Yeah, there you go.
Oh,
Okay, now last time, Roger. Okay, get it.
is there one more?
What do we do now?
Who says that? Roger. What do we do now? Again, I want to resist the temptation to end a talk with some kind of solution or some kind of way forward, because again, like the COT fetish, like the indigenous fetish, the fetish that of hope of, okay, let's get all walk away from here with a sense that there's some kind of solution at least proposed that we can start to work towards. Again, I think that's a displacement activity. I think we need to sit with the deadlock we're in and look at and start, as Anna Singh suggested in the quote I read towards the start of the paper, learn to be attentive to what's actually going on around us instead of immediately trying to escape into a way out of it. And I think that I mean, I'm in no way condemning Bangor Carnival or the people that looted that art performance. Bangor Carnival was one of the best parties I've ever been to, and the people looting the art performance were absolutely in their rights to do so, rather than sitting there and letting some middle-class artist come in from outside and expect them to perform their prescribed role as good indigenous people who care about extractives. You know, like, you can put all the stuff in front of us, we're just going to take it. Yeah. So I think there's a rebellious impulse there, both in the carnival and in the looting. And I think that holds lessons for us. And I want to draw that, and that interests me more than kind of trying to figure out how we're going to like meet the SDGs.
Follow-up question.
You get off the panel. This can keep going.
One more thing.
Yeah.
That's what's one more.
Well, this one here, we do need to understand global capitalism and its issues, but if we do not bring this down to local individual interventions, then what's the use? Well, this was a local case. Yeah, we could go on with this conversation, and perhaps you and I will get the chance to. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks, Japhy. Okay, thank you everyone who was on Teams for attending. Let me stop. Stop recording.